Maybe it means something. 2 September 2016, 9:12 a.m., 42 degrees, 26 minutes, 41.6 seconds north, 87 degrees, 49 minutes, 32.5 seconds west. When I say the dream means nothing, I mean that it has nothing to do with my main story. The story of my 2009 vacation. I mean that my dream about the murder isn't a prefiguration of anything, and it doesn't have any thematic resonances, at least none that I can think of, with the rest of what happened on that journey. What I'm trying to say is, this isn't a story about murder. Speaking of murder, or its absence, the walk to Canossa is kind of unusual for a major event in European history in that it was relatively non-violent. Nobody got killed. No churches were burned down. No populations were expelled. Of course, it took place against a backdrop of more or less constant warfare, and Henry would keep battling against Matilda and Gregory for pretty much the rest of their lives. But compared to, say, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, or the defenestration of Prague, or the Commune of Paris, that is, compared to some of the other events that have catchy names, the walk to Canossa stands out for being an almost purely symbolic event, an event that belongs to the realms of performance, ritual, and law, and to chess. I've always been fascinated by how much it's like chess. You see, Canossa happened at basically the same time that the Indian, Persian, Arabic game, with its Shah, Counselor, and Elephant, was becoming Europeanized into a lineup of king, queen, and bishop, recast into those familiar and highly abstracted symbols of medieval warfare, the standard chess pieces. And the walk to Canossa has it all. A king and a queen on one side, a pope and a contessa on the other, bishops, knights, a castle, and the story itself involves a dazzling diagonal counterattack that transforms an almost certain defeat into a draw, or maybe a stalemate. But sometimes that's what the player is fighting for. At one point in my life, I wanted to write an article about the walk to Canossa and the origins of modern chess, but I never got around to it. Anyway, the only murder directly connected with this story is the murder of Godfrey the Hunchback, Matilda's husband, the Duke of Lower Lotharingia, which led to Henry giving the dukedom to his little son Conrad just to keep things in the family. But that murder took place in January 1076, a full year before the events at Canossa, so it's part of the backstory, along with Henry trying to fire Gregory and Gregory trying to fire Henry. It's clear, at least to me, that my dream didn't have anything to do with that murder, even though I had just met those two characters named Gozilo, one of whom, the older one, sure fit the description of Godfrey the Hunchback perfectly. I mean, except for the Vespa and the black biker leathers. So I'm very certain that my dream was just a wrong turn, a dead end, an unfortunate intrusion of my subconscious into a story where it didn't belong. But that's the thing. My subconscious. I'm afraid I can't go on without admitting that there is one sense in which the dream did mean something. A minor sense. There's no crime involved, but You see, when I read those two posts, the last two posts of my 2009 blog, the ones about me wandering through the early morning streets of Strasbourg, it wasn't even an hour ago when I read them. I got a very strong emotional buzz. I recognized the emotion, the guilt, the paranoia, the panic. I knew exactly where it came from. It was probably sometime in 2004, 5 years before my European trip. Things seemed to be going great in my life. My wife was off at a conference, and I worked by myself on our remodeling project until 10 or 11. It was a Friday night. My wife had called to apologize for leaving me alone, but the closing session the next morning was going to be just too important to miss. And after I put the tools away, I was still wide awake. And for some reason, I decided to visit the bar where I used to hang out before I got married. The crowd was a lot younger than I remembered, or maybe I was just older. My plan was to have one drink and go home. Then a woman came in, and I recognized her. She had been one of the nurses from the emergency room when a whole crowd of them used to come in every night, just after midnight. I could tell from the way the bartender treated her that she was still a regular customer. She and I were the only people over 40 in the bar. We started talking. She looked really good. She was now some kind of nurse supervisor, the only one on her team who still got off work at midnight. All her colleagues now worked 12-hour shifts from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., no good for socializing. We managed to talk for hours without mentioning relationships or commitments. At a certain point, she put her phone away, stopped checking it. I had already done the same thing. When the bar closed, she invited me to her apartment for a glass of corky Merlot, and I accepted her offer. She made fun of me for talking so much beforehand, but eventually we had sex. A framed photo of her boyfriend watched us. At least I think that's who it was, one of the doctors from the emergency room. I vaguely remembered his face. He had been an intern 10 years before, when I hung out in that bar. The following weekend I was shopping with my wife at the grocery store. We were looking at the display of mangoes or papayas or something, and debating whether it was worth the trouble to make the extra trip to the supermercado on the other side of town, where the produce prices were so much cheaper and the quality just as good, when I saw her, the nurse supervisor, over near the lettuce. And for a moment, that is, for 20 or 30 seconds, I felt an overwhelming wave of guilt and terror and cowardice, a feeling that I had done something horribly, unforgivably wrong. When I read those posts this morning, it came back to me. That feeling, exactly the same feeling. Of course, in the dream I raised the stakes, exaggerated the circumstances, murder, whereas what I had done in real life was engage in extramarital sex. But wow, the emotional content, that was the same. Luckily, the nurse supervisor never made eye contact with me. Maybe she had her own guilt to deal with, or maybe she was accustomed to situations like that. Of course, later on, when my wife told me what she had been up to that weekend, that Friday night at the conference, I realized that I had absolutely nothing to feel guilty about. My conscious mind forgave my behavior that night, and in fact reclassified it from cheating to tit for tat. But I guess my subconscious mind never got that memo, never received the absolution. I wonder if all that guilt is still inside me somewhere, just waiting for a disruption in my sleep patterns to come spilling out.